Thank you for joining us today for the module Hand Washing, Why It Matters. This module will go over the science behind hand washing, how poor hand washing can lead to foodborne illness, the steps you can do to increase hand washing compliance, and we'll give some real-life examples of outbreaks linked to poor hand washing. Hand washing is one of the most important risk mitigation steps you can do as a school food service employee to reduce the likelihood that a child at a North Carolina school gets sick, if practiced properly. If we look at inspection reports, especially related to food service, which includes schools, we don't see great hand washing compliance. In a general food service setting, such as a full-service restaurant, the FDA suggests that hand washing compliance is around 24%. This means that over 75% of the time, when a hand washing step was necessary, it wasn't completed. This data is based on a national study carried out over the past 10 years. Fortunately, school settings are much better about hand washing than full-service restaurants. Depending on the study, compliance can be as high as 80% in school settings. However, that still means that 20% of the time, school food service employees did not wash their hands when they should have. A lot of social value is placed around hand washing. As is shown by this graphic, not only can people hear when you go to the bathroom, they can hear when you don't wash your hands. In our culture, it is important to wash your hands in this type of situation. When it is not done correctly, it will be noticed and pointed out as a social issue. This is an example of a hand washing sign from a restaurant in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is more of a comical sign when it comes to hand washing, but shows the types of things you would see in your kitchen as reminders or cues of the importance of hand washing for you and your staff. The sign reads, "In an effort to prevent illness and to control the spread of disease, the laws of the great state of North Carolina and common decency require that all employees wash both hands with soap and water after using this or any other bathroom. If an employee is not available, we really encourage you to wash your own hands, please." Again, these are the types of reminders we see around hand washing stations and around restaurants. It is an important thing for us to focus on. Every time a hand washing event is necessary, there should be a cue that the tools are there and a reminder for us to wash our hands. A North Carolina congressman, Senator Tom Tillis, used hand washing as an example of overregulation in North Carolina. He gave the example of going into a Starbucks and seeing a food handler coming out of a restroom. His opinion was that this employee was overregulated and doesn't need to wash his hands, because by law, there only needs to be a disclosure or sign that says that the employees at Starbucks are not required to wash their hands. Although this example was included here as a joke, it is not acceptable for many reasons, especially in our setting. This argument does not fit very well with you because the children and students you are serving every day, unlike Starbucks customers, do not really have a choice to eat or not eat at school. We want to make sure that everyone in the kitchen and those handling food in the schools are washing their hands at the correct time. How important is hand washing? We will discuss some statistics in a few minutes, but first we'll give some story examples that show why we need hand washing. In these incidents, poor hand washing has been implicated as a factor leading to a foodborne illness outbreak. In Australia, a 2015 hepatitis A outbreak linked to frozen mixed berries led to about 20 illnesses. The investigation pointed towards frozen raspberries as the likely vehicle. Looking at the investigation and past issues with the product, it is likely a case of poor hand washing and hygiene among the workers involved with picking the berries. The berries were imported from China, But if you look back at the statistics on hand washing in restaurants that were cited earlier, it doesn't matter where the berries came from. The practices are still the same, and the compliance rates with those practices are not always very high. In this case, we can absolutely say that hand washing was a factor in these illnesses. How do pathogens, or bugs that make people sick, get on hands? In a cafeteria setting, there are two major pathways for this to happen. You may be familiar with some of these viruses and bacteria. When it comes to hepatitis A, norovirus, Shigella, Giardia, and sometimes Salmonella, the source of the pathogen is usually from human feces or poop. The amount of bacteria or virus in just a small amount of human poop is staggering. If you look at the amount of poop that would be on a pinhead, there would be millions of billions of virus particles on that little speck. Poop-to-hand transmission is a massively important mechanism for hands becoming contaminated with viruses or bacteria. The other pathway is picking up bacteria and sometimes viruses from food. Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter, or other pathogens may end up on the outside of different foods. Raw meat is a food that we typically think of as maybe being contaminated with bacteria. We may see 10 to 20,000 bacterial cells per milliliter of juice per piece of meat on the outside. You can think of a milliliter of juice as a very small amount that would not quite fill the bottom of a teaspoon. There are about 15 milliliters in a teaspoon, so not very much juice is needed to contain tens of thousands of bacteria. Raw carrots and onions, on the other hand, are not foods we typically think of as being contaminated with bacteria. However, these foods are ones we need to worry about because they are grown in the soil. This is not just theoretical. A large outbreak in restaurants in England a few years ago was linked to cross-contamination where hands were a factor. Contaminated raw carrots and onions, which were then cooked, became cross-contaminated again from hands that were contaminated with pathogens and not washed. Those hands were then used to create ready-to-eat meals. Data from past outbreaks shows that 89% of outbreaks linked to contamination from food handling were caused by pathogens that were transferred from workers' hands. In these outbreaks, the problem was in the kitchen from cross-contamination or a sick food handler. This is why we need to focus on hand washing on a daily basis. You don't have to be ill to transfer contamination to your hands and then to your food. Norovirus and Salmonella are both pathogens and illnesses where food handlers can carry these microorganisms or bugs without actually being ill. They would still be shedding these through their feces. We see around 1 million cases of Salmonella each year, and it is the leading cause of death from foodborne illness in the U.S. We see about 5 million cases of norovirus linked to foodborne illness each year across the U.S. There are thousands and thousands of cases of both of these pathogens associated with foodborne illness in North Carolina every year. We want to make sure we are doing our best in schools to not be a source of foodborne illness. But if we were a source, it would mostly be coming from contaminated hands. Although not as large as the one in Australia, another hepatitis A outbreak in 2015 in New Jersey was linked to a restaurant setting and was caused by an ill food handler. Imagine this scenario. One of your colleagues or staff members comes to you and says, "I've been diagnosed with hepatitis A and I'm not really sure where I got it from, but I haven't been ill very long. 30 days before my symptoms showed up, I might have been exposing students coming through this cafeteria to the virus, and I didn't even know it." This is the situation that happened in New Jersey. After the ill food handler was identified with the virus, health clinics were held for the people exposed. Over 1,000 people had eaten at the restaurant during the days when the food handler had worked and could receive the hepatitis A vaccinations after exposure. Getting a hepatitis A shot within 2 weeks after exposure will protect you from getting the virus. Even though those health clinics were held, 3 individuals who had eaten at the restaurant came down with hepatitis A linked to that food handler because they did not take the vaccination seriously and did not get vaccinated. Those 3 individuals could have done something, but they were only exposed to that virus because the food handler was not very good at washing hands. We know this because there is no other source of hepatitis A besides humans. The only way that those people got sick was from the food handler, who had gone to the bathroom, likely had a bowel movement, and picked up those virus particles on their hands. There are lots of different ways that a person can get poop, and therefore the virus particles, on their hands, including issues with toilet paper. Once on the person's hands, it got into the food because of poor hand washing. Now this restaurant is facing probably a few $1 million in lawsuits and may potentially go out of business. These real situations are very current and are all related to hand washing issues. It's not just salads or sandwiches that we worry about. There was a very large outbreak of norovirus in Japan in 2014 that was linked to bread. This outbreak affected schools because the bread manufacturer that was supplying the schools had contaminated bread. Over 1,000 children got sick. Hand washing issues in the bakery that made the bread were identified during the investigation. The exact norovirus strain, the one that had the same genetic makeup, was then discovered in the restroom at the bakery. The only way that virus got into the bread was through someone's hands and through poor hand washing. These are just 3 examples, but we have seen hundreds of outbreaks in the past 20 years that have been linked to hand washing. Hand washing compliance is a problem, but what about foodborne illness? We have already discussed the rates of foodborne illness from salmonella and norovirus, but where does it all come from? A lot of foodborne illness, especially norovirus, comes from restaurants. Looking at this graph, schools have a low prevalence of outbreaks, but 3% of those outbreaks related to foodborne norovirus do come from schools. There are approximately 48 billion cases of foodborne illness each year in the U.S. Foodborne illness results in around 3,000 deaths and over 125,000 hospitalizations. It's a big problem. We've had outbreaks related to our schools in North Carolina in the past, and fortunately we don't see too many of them annually. But we know that they happen. Just because we don't see them doesn't mean that those risks aren't there and that illnesses aren't occurring. As we've already mentioned, just washing your hands while you're ill is not enough. Well, food handlers can also be a source of foodborne illness. Let's take a look at some data to support this. Researchers in Minnesota studied outbreaks that were associated with restaurants. They used restaurant-associated outbreaks because it gave them more locations to use and a greater number of outbreaks to study compared to other food service settings. During their investigations, they required food handlers in those restaurants to provide stool samples to see whether they were carriers of the salmonella. 53% of the food handlers that were found to be salmonella positive had not reported any recent illnesses. This shows that even in situations where no one is sick, half of your colleagues and your staff could be carrying salmonella without showing any symptoms. This makes hand washing so much more important because it's the only way to keep pathogens out of someone's food. The food code, which the HACCP in your school's program is based on, has specific hand washing requirements. It requires that all food handlers follow specific hand washing procedures. We will go through those procedures now, not just to show that these individual steps are important, but to show the research behind each individual step. What is happening in the first step of rinsing your hands? Rinsing washes off any large particles that are on your hands. This includes anything that could soil your hands and prevent soap or any other actions in hand washing from working. Although the science shows that water temperature doesn't matter in terms of removing bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli, water temperature does make a difference by loosening any soil that is there. Warmer water especially helps loosen fat-based soils, such as grease or oils, by melting some of the fat and allowing you to rinse it off. The food code does not require any specific temperature of water to wash hands, but we do know that people in North Carolina are more likely to wash their hands in warm water. The next step in hand washing is using soap. It really doesn't matter whether the soap is regular or antibacterial. There isn't much good data or research to suggest that antibacterial matters more or less than non-antibacterial soap. Soap, by definition, has antibacterial properties. This step matters because using soap makes it easier to rinse off things like soil, fats, and oils, and makes them more soluble in water. It will also start to remove some of the bugs that are on your hands. These two components, the rinse and the soap, serve to first rinse off any soil and then to loosen any of the debris that might be stuck on your hands. The next step is scrubbing. Scrubbing takes off somewhere between 90 and 99% of any of the bacteria that are on your hands. It is the mechanical rubbing that really matters. The mechanical action of rubbing hands for 10 to 15 seconds is going to remove the pathogens. By first adding some water, then loosening them with soap, and finally scrubbing is going to knock off any bugs into the sink. It's important in this step to be very thorough around fingernails because they are the part of your hand that has been found to harbor the most bacteria. Next, we have another step of rinsing again. Now that you've vigorously rubbed your hands and removed a bunch of stuff, this second rinse step is going to knock off even more of the pathogens. By adding more water, this step basically dilutes the pathogens. Drying, the final step of hand washing, is one that is not done very well for the most part. Several years ago, Dr. Ben Chapman conducted a research project at NC State to study hand washing in institutional kitchens. Video cameras were put up in institutional kitchens to observe hand washing and cross-contamination. His team observed that the hand washing step that was done worst was drying. The drying step is one that does matter. You will remove an extra 90% of the pathogens that remain after the previous 4 steps by drying your hands properly. We suggest drying them not on clothes or aprons, but on single-use paper towels, because you want to get rid of what's on your hands. North Carolina Cooperative Extension's training curriculum for school food service, called the HACCP in Your School program, follows these steps exactly. Each hand washing step serves an important part because with each step you are removing another 90 to 99% of pathogens that might be on your hands. We know that people have a lot of bacteria on their hands. The bacteria on your hands are sometimes good bacteria. However, what you're trying to do is to remove the bacteria that have been added on through food or by using the bathroom. You are never going to get to the point where your hands have zero bacteria on them, but when you wash your hands, you can do your best to remove 99.9% of the bad bacteria that aren't living there all the time. You may be wondering whether or not nail brushes are effective for removing bacteria. The answer is yes, they absolutely do make a difference. We have mentioned already that nails are a place where bacteria like to live and where we find a lot of pathogens. Using a nail brush will make the scrubbing action more vigorous and create a better lather when with soap. We will do a better job at hand washing with one than without one, especially if you are scrubbing throughout the whole hand. You also may be wondering how to clean nail brushes and if they can be used for multiple food handlers. The best way to clean them is to store them in a sanitizer bucket like you would a rag in your kitchen. If you do that, the sanitizer will take care of any bugs that are on the nail brush. How long the brushes last depends on their quality. Hand washing compliance, as we have already discussed, is as low as 24% in food service restaurants. On average, across all food handlers, compliance of hand washing is around 40%. However, it is quite higher in school settings compared to other settings. Why don't people wash their hands? You may ask yourself, why don't I always wash my hands? People are busy. Dr. Chapman's research observing hand washing in kitchens showed that hand washing compliance went way down when the kitchen was busy, often around lunch and breakfast service. Hand washing compliance decreased in situations where lots of people were coming around at once instead of the number of people being spread out over time. Sometimes hand washing isn't done well because people are wearing gloves. There is a false sense of security around glove use. People often think that just because they are wearing gloves, they don't need to wash their hands as much. Glove use doesn't mean that. Gloves are pretty good at transferring pathogens, even a little better than you would see with bare hands. After removing gloves, you are still required to wash your hands. We have a no bare hand contact rule, and we want to make sure we continue with that. But just because you are wearing gloves doesn't mean you don't need to wash your hands. We also see problems with hand washing because the right tools are not in place. Too often there is no soap, there are too few hand washing stations, or there are no paper towels. Making sure that your cafeteria manager is stocking those hand washing stations really matters because it impacts whether or not you can wash your hands correctly. Poor location of hand washing stations is not something that can be changed very easily in a school setting, but we know that if a hand sink is too far away, it is likely to lead to someone not using it. The value food handlers place on hand washing also impacts whether or not or how often they wash their hands. Even though all of the tools are there and it's not too busy, someone may still make the decision that they don't think it matters. Seeing others they work with not washing their hands can reinforce the employee's decision. It appears that by not washing their hands, those other employees don't think it matters either. Another reason why people don't wash their hands is because they don't know the consequences. We hope that the stories we have shared about recent situations where foodborne illness has been transferred by poor hand washing show how serious the consequences can be. How do we increase hand washing compliance? The research says reinforcing hand hygiene messages in your system, with your staff, and with your colleagues is very effective. Make sure you are all doing the right things at the right time and then recognizing and reinforcing the correct behaviors. For example, when you see another employee washing their hands, you may say something like, "Oh, that was a good time for washing your hands. Good job for washing your hands." Or you could help reinforce correct hand washing behaviors by reminding individuals that after doing something like handling raw chicken or a trash can, they need to wash their hands before going back to putting on their gloves and handling ready-to-eat foods. Much of our knowledge on what works to increase hand washing comes from nurses and doctors in healthcare settings. Monitoring, providing feedback, knowing how often we should be washing our hands, knowing if we are actually washing our hands as often as we should, and providing education have all been shown to increase hand washing. Having a manager or some other senior staff member in a kitchen situation modeling the correct behaviors has been shown to be especially effective for increasing hand washing. We know that if these individuals are role modeling good hand washing, their staff is much more likely to hand wash at the correct times. Strategies to increase hand washing compliance within your kitchen include evaluating your food preparation timing, staffing shifts appropriately, and creating more time for increased preparation when it is busy. Evaluating food preparation timing helps you decide on the right times for food preparation so it can be done safely and correctly, allowing more time for employees to wash hands. Ensuring that shifts are staffed appropriately helps things run smoothly during busy times and avoids employees not washing their hands because they are too busy. You may be wondering if you can use hand sanitizers instead of soap and water. Hand sanitizers are not an acceptable replacement for hand washing. Not all hand sanitizers are the same. If you want to strengthen your hand hygiene and hand washing system within the kitchen, hand washing and then using a post-hand wash sanitizer step is fantastic. It is a great way to approach better hand hygiene. Only using hand sanitizer instead of hand washing, especially as you change gloves or do tasks where you might contaminate hands, is not acceptable. If you are using hand sanitizer, make sure it has an alcohol concentration of at least 60%. Hand sanitizer has almost no efficacy against norovirus. This means it does not work at all against norovirus. Using it if you have an outbreak of norovirus in your school, or if you are caring for an ill family member with norovirus, will not reduce your risk of getting norovirus. Alcohol-based hand sanitizers don't have any kill effect on norovirus. It will act against E. coli, salmonella, and even flu, but will not do anything against norovirus. For more information about this virus and why it is such a problem in schools, watch our module on norovirus. If you have any questions about today's webinar, please contact Dr. Ben Chapman. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about why hand washing matters, especially for food service employees. We hope you will join us next time for another module on school food safety.